What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Simon Says. All right, today I want to talk about the influence that men have that I don't think we're actually aware that we have, right? Um, what really got me on this word, the last video that I put out talking about biblical relationships, I read Ephesians chapter 5, I believe it was verse 25, where it talks about that a man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. And then in that verse, it says that, he's making her clean, making her holy, and this, that, and the third. And it really got me thinking, like, if, a man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church, and you look at the example that Christ set, he set for men to follow as Christ himself, essentially. One of the things that he did was he set a certain standard, and he would call out the church whenever the church did not follow that standard, right? His standard never changed. He never moved away from God's word. He never tried to say, hey, it's okay for you to do whatever you want to do because maybe you're in a certain circumstance. He never wavered from the standard. He kept it up, essentially. And so one thing I saw from that was not just talking about the standard that a man has to keep within a marriage, but the standard that men in general have to keep within our society. And this is what I want to talk about when I say that men have an influence that we are not really aware of, right? So we've heard the term daddy issues be a thing. It's more of a thing with my generation nowadays, and it really just typically refers to mostly women, right? But if you as a man, you say you're going out, you're meeting a young woman, right? And she starts acting a certain way. Maybe she doesn't really respect men. Maybe she doesn't have a good outlook of men in general. Typically, we say that maybe she has some daddy issues. Maybe her father wasn't there in her life, or maybe the father that she did wasn't necessarily a great man. He wasn't consistent with his presence, or he just didn't have any sort of influence on her, right? So, and typically on the reverse of that, when you see someone who is a very well-rounded person, they have a good understanding of the world, they have, a good head on their shoulders, you can typically find that there was either a great father influence, or there was somebody that was a male who was an influence in their life, who helped them out. Maybe it was a mentor, maybe it was an uncle or grandpa or whoever, right? But typically there is a positive male influence in their life, right? So one thing that we have to understand within our society is very competitive, right? And what I mean by competitive is we all want to see success in our life. And because we all want to be successful, we look for those who are already successful in the area that maybe we want to do, or just in just life in general, right? And so that's why a lot of us, we follow celebrities, athletes, rappers, people who are already successful. Maybe they have a lot of money or they have a lot of clout, right? And we try to emulate whatever characteristics they are emulating, right? So if you are, for example, Cardi B has a very certain, I don't want to say aesthetic, but she has a very certain behavior about her, right? So now you'll see a lot of women who look at Cardi B and they'll try to emulate what Cardi B does in the hopes that they get to where she's at. Maybe, they get a record deal about her rapping about the stuff that she raps about. Maybe they meet a guy like Offset who has a lot of money and just simply wants them because of how they look, right? That tends to be what our society does. We look to the people who are successful within life in general. And so what ends up happening is, as men, particularly a lot of men, when we want to be successful, we look to the men that are already successful and we start to emulate their behavior. Unfortunately, a lot of successful men don't emulate good behavior. This is not to say that, all of a sudden being rich is a bad thing. No. And I think that's a misconception between, I think a lot of people have that, if you're a Christian, that you shouldn't be rich. No. The Bible says that it's easier for an eye to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get into heaven. It doesn't say it's impossible, but what it requires is humility, right? You have to humble yourself before God, even with all the riches that you have. And that is a trait that a lot of successful men don't have, is that humility. And humility isn't like, oh, woe is me, I'm not great, I'm not this, I'm not. No, humility is simply having an accurate worldview, which is regardless of how much money you can attain, regardless of how high of a status you can reach, regardless of how big your house is, how nice the car you drive, how many servers, waitresses, all these things that you have, the value of your character, well, I'm sorry. You as an individual are not more significant than somebody else, right? Like the value of your character is equal to the value of somebody else's character, right? That's when we talk about people say, "Oh, we're all the same." We're not talking about like we don't all have the same status, but it's the value of the character, and that is what we should kind of focus on, right? Unfortunately, that's not what we focus on. What we tend to focus on is simply attaining the riches, the fame, and being like the men that we see that are successful. And what do we see from the successful men? We see promiscuity, all right? We see unfaithfulness, infidelity, right? How many rich men do we know that are stepping out on their wives? Who are or being so promiscuous that they have multiple children with multiple women, right? How many successful men do we see who are rude to people who are just trying to get by in life, trying to do their everyday jobs? All the the celebrities that go out to a restaurant and they're like, "Oh, do you know who I am?" They expect the best service from the world essentially because they've made it to a certain status in life. That's the type of influence that these men have. And like a lot of celebrities, most of these people, I don't believe they set out to influence the world. No, I simply think that they are in a position where the whole world looks at them. And because the whole world looks at them and says, "This is where I want to be in their position," I am therefore going to emulate what they do, right? Because it's natural. You do what you see or what you do that which the successful people do so that you can be one of them, right? It's called fake it till you make it, essentially, right? And that's what a lot of us do in our lives. We try to fake it until we make it. You want to look the part so that we can be the part. The reason that Ephesians chapter 5 really emulated with me is because there is a dynamic between men and women that I don't think men or women really understand, which is, men have to lead. And that's just going to be a controversial statement. It's going to cause a lot of uproar, especially if you are one of these women that feel like, can also be the head of the household. It's not what the topic is about, but I do believe that men should lead. However, if the men don't lead, or if the men are leading to an area that is neither good nor holy nor upholds the standards of God, what you're leading the women into is chaos. And the women are going to respond naturally because, hey, if there's a leader, there's a follower, right? And if you're, as a man, if you're leading your family, if you're leading your society into chaos and the response from the followers is chaotic, right? The only thing that you can do is to lead them out of that chaos. You have to become more disciplined. You have to start emulating the standard of God. You have to start being the type of man that says, "Okay, I have this influence that I've been put in. I've been put in this position. This is my responsibility. I need to start leading my family, my society, my community, people who are looking up to me. I need to start leading them away from the chaos and leading them into the righteousness of God." I wholeheartedly believe that's the only way that we're going to see any change in relationships in our society, right? Because all of us, not all of us, but a lot of us that are struggling with relationships, we're like, "Hey, why doesn't the other person act this way?" Like, a lot of women will complain like, "Hey, why do men want to be X, Y, and Z?" And then a lot of men will complain like, "Well, why do women want to be X, Y, and Z?" There's this idea that or not idea, but there's a relationship between men and women, which is one responds to the other. And that's honestly the best way I can put it. If as a man, what the values that you uphold are not that of love, are not that of protection, are not that of sacrifice, are not that of righteousness, then the only other response that can come from that is the same response that we're seeing with a lot of promiscuous women today. That's the only other kind of response that we can see, right? It's not up to them to just all of a sudden be like, "Oh, well, I'm going to be someone who cares, who is faithful, who is loving, who is kind." You cannot have that kind of response to somebody who says, "I'm going to go out into the world, do what I want to do everything for my own gain, and I'm not going to love you." It just simply will not work. We've seen these kind of relationships and they don't last, right? And here's an example that I think is very valid in a situation, right? In the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, Adam and Eve were created, right? Adam was made from the dirt, the dust of the ground, the clay of the ground, right? And God put Adam to sleep, and he took out a rib, and he made Eve from the rib of Adam, right? Now, God gave Adam a commandment. He said, you can eat of every fruit of every tree that is in the garden, but of the fruit of the tree of the garden, of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you cannot eat. That was essentially his commandment to Adam. That was the standard. Adam, do everything else, but don't eat of this tree. Don't do that. That's God's standard. Well, I'm sure that Adam passed it down to Eve, because Eve, when the serpent came up to her and said that God tell you shouldn't eat of every tree, Eve said, no, we can eat of every tree, but we cannot eat, nor can we touch the fruit of the tree of the garden of good and evil. Now, here is where I believe that Adam has some responsibility, right? Because during the exchange between Eve and the snake, right, Adam was nowhere to be found. Or maybe he was there, but he was quiet, right? Adam wasn't vocal. He didn't come in and say, hey, go away, snake. You're not part of God's plan. He didn't come and do that. He did not come and uphold the standard. Instead, what happened was Eve was it persuaded? Yeah, Eve was persuaded to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Why? Because the snake told her that you will be like God, knowing good and evil, right? And so she ate of the tree. She gave the fruit to Adam, and he ate of it. Now, I'm pretty sure Adam knew that the fruit that he was eating was from the knowledge of good and evil. But the thing that I want to focus on is during the exchange between Eve and the snake, Adam was silent, or he wasn't present. And to me, that is a failure on his part. I'm being critical here, and hindsight is 2020. But what that signifies is the lack of upholding the standard, right? Which I think is a man's responsibility, is to uphold God's standard. And I'll say this to kind of end the video, right? I know I talk a lot about, living a good life and also cover relationships, but it's also bigger than that. Because as a man, if you uphold God's standard, but when you are confronted with something that you know to be wrong, or an opportunity to upholds God's standard, and you are either silent or you do not step in the way you should step in, what ends up happening is chaos. And that chaos, although you may say, well, it wasn't my fault, because if you read on later, what did Adam say? He said, hey, the woman that you gave me the fruit. No, Adam, you weren't there. Adam wasn't there. And for a lot of us men, we aren't there. We're not upholding that standard. We're not present, or we're not vocal. We're seeing what is wrong, and we allow it to take place. I'm not saying jump in front of a bullet. I'm not saying jump in front of a gun or jump in front of a knife. That is your own. I will leave that up to you to do what you will when the moment arrives. But there are certain situations where we clearly see that it is neither God's standard nor our standard, and yet we allow it to go on because maybe it's just easier to be quiet. It's just easier to let it happen. And if that is our mentality as men, we then cannot be surprised when the rest of the world follows suit. If we're leading our community, our societies into chaos, we cannot be surprised when our societies, our children, our wives respond in kind. We have to be the example that God set forth. We have to love our wives as Christ loved the church, making her holy. So uphold the standard. Be the kind of man that God has called you to be. Be the kind of man that upholds God's standard so that the rest of the world will follow suit. The world will naturally follow us men. There's great responsibility, but there's also great, I hate to use this term, man, from Spider-Man. Uncle Ben told Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? We do have great power. We have the ability to quite literally change the world for better or for worse. I rather choose for better. And it just so happens that God has given us the manuscript on how to change the world for better. But it starts with us upholding his standard and not ours. Because if we're simply out there in the world trying to live for our own selfish pleasure, trying to do whatever feels good in the moment, or trying to just bolster ourselves up, then the natural response from women and from our children is that of selfishness and self-interest. And if we're walking around like, why can't I find somebody to love me? Well, Are you the type of person that is upholding God's standard, or are you simply taking advantage of the situation that you're in? Anyway, guys, it's been a long video. It's my word for the day. Hope it made sense. I hope you guys understood what I was trying to say. Hope it touched some of you, maybe convicted some of you. I know it convicted me. Start maybe doing a little better in my own personal life. Anyway, guys, that's it. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you on another video. Deuces.